My son passed away just a month after he was born. I can't even start to explain how it happened without breaking down, but I'll never forget the sound of my wife's tears. Grief is messy. It's so damn messy. When we lost him, it felt like my wife was tearing herself apart from the inside out. Her cries, no, her screams, could have broken glass or made your blood freeze. She screamed at the universe, at whatever cruel, heartless force allowed this to happen. She screamed at herself, at me. Her voice gave out before her grief ever did, leaving her throat raw and shredded. I'll be honest, I didn't cry. I can't even remember if a single tear fell. But it wasn't because I wasn't devastated. I think it was because she cried enough for both of us. Nothing in this world is more heart-wrenching than the sound of a mother's grief. I wish there was some kind of guide, a Grief for Dummies book or something, especially for the before and after. Before, you're just stuck waiting, watching the last grains of sand fall through the hourglass. My heart pounded as the monitor flatlined, and the reality hit me like a tidal wave. You're going to have to grieve now, I thought. Before I even felt the pain, I knew it was coming for me, barreling down like a freight train. I tried to prepare myself, but the truth is, you can't. No one ever can. Then comes the after. It's not when you leave the hospital or even the drive home. It's when you step through your front door. The air gets sucked out of the house, and you feel that awful, gaping void in your chest, your marriage, your home. And you think, this is it. This is my life now. This is real. What made it even worse was how familiar that emptiness felt. It was like going back to life before he was born, except now I knew exactly what I'd lost. And I hated myself for it. I wasn't mourning him, not really. I was mourning the life he could have had. His first birthday, his first steps, his graduations. I would have traded anything, even a shouting match with a moody teenager, for all of that. My wife grieved differently. She missed the tiny moments, the feel of his skin, the way she'd hum to him, even the exhaustion of dragging herself out of bed at 3 a.m. because he was crying again. We didn't talk about it much, but we didn't have to. I could see it in the way she moved, in how she kept her distance. We were like two travelers on separate paths of grief, with our backs always turned to each other. At night, she'd flinch if I reached for her, like my touch burned. But I didn't push. I knew she needed space. The funeral was pure hell. Actually, I think hell might have been easier than watching them bury my child. I walked up to his casket alone, staring at something no parent should ever have to see. And all I could think was, caskets shouldn't be this small. It was so tiny I could have held it in my arms. And when they lowered him into the ground, my wife's cries tore through the morning air. It sounded like her heart was breaking all over again. She didn't fall into my arms. She fell to the ground, like she wanted to follow him into the earth. Then you come home and open that door again, and somehow, the void feels even deeper. We packed up his nursery and his future into a bunch of cardboard boxes. We fought over what to do with them. She wanted to keep them in the attic, but I told her I couldn't handle knowing they were up there. In the end, we left everything in the room. The door stayed shut, but never locked. It felt symbolic in a way, like we'd closed that chapter of our lives, but weren't ready to lock it away for good. Every day doesn't exactly get easier. It just gets further from the day everything fell apart. But mornings? Those are the hardest. You wake up, the sunlight sneaking through the curtains, and for a split second, life feels normal. Then it hits you, like it does every single day. You're grieving, as if you could ever forget. The tiniest things started to set us off. Dishes left in the sink could spiral into a full-blown argument, leaving one of us storming out for a midnight drive or sleeping on the couch. We tried couples therapy, but the truth was, we needed more than that. A lot more. It wasn't just about us. It was about him. The wedge between us had his name written all over it. I was completely lost, grasping at straws to figure out how to handle everything. But it seemed like my wife was already a step ahead. One evening, I came home from work to the faint sound of humming coming from our bedroom. My heart sank. It was the same lullaby she used to hum at the hospital, right before the heart monitor went quiet. I climbed the stairs, my brow furrowed, and nudged the door open. What I saw made me freeze. There she was, lying on the bed, cradling something in her arms. The way she looked at it, it was like she was gazing at the entire universe, every star and planet all at once. For a moment, I wondered if I was dreaming. I even pinched my thigh to make sure I was awake. The sting told me I was, but none of it felt real. Honey? I stammered. Her head lifted, and for the first time in forever, she smiled. A fragile, unfamiliar smile. Oh, hi, she said, her voice light, almost cheerful. I stared at her, at the bundle in her arms. What are you holding? Oh, this? She glanced down at it, and then back at me. It's a reborn doll. A what? My confusion must have been written all over my face. They're realistic dolls, she explained, her voice rushing as if to justify it. For mothers, to help us cope. She nodded quickly, but her smile was already starting to falter, like my question had shattered a fragile illusion. Oh, I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, watching her hold it like it was real, like it was him. Has it helped? I finally asked. I've only had it for a few hours, she admitted, looking down at it again. But it's comforting. It unsettled me at first, the whole idea of it. But nothing else had worked, so if this was helping her, I decided to let it be. Do you want to hold him? She asked softly. I froze. My mind raced, torn between wanting to support her and the sheer impossibility of pretending that doll was my son. But I knew this wasn't about me. So, with shaky hands, I stepped forward and stretched out my arms. The cold plastic sent a chill through me as she placed it in my hands. I cradled it, staring down at its too perfect face, and suddenly, I broke. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, tears pouring out of me like a dam had burst. I held that doll, shaking and sobbing, my face twisted in a way I didn't even recognize. I knew it wasn't him, but holding it, even for a moment, brought back everything I'd been holding in. The love, the loss, the memories we'd never get to make. My wife sat patiently, watching as I cried harder than I ever had in my life. That day marked a turning point. Things didn't magically get better, but the doll filled some of the emptiness for a while, just enough to keep the voids at bay. On the rough days, when my wife couldn't even muster the strength to stand, she'd hold it close. She'd hum to it, rock it, sometimes even pretend to nurse it. I won't lie, it still unnerved me. It was comforting, sure, but it wasn't real. It wasn't him. And in some ways, I think it made the distance between us even wider. Then one evening, I came home and noticed light spilling out from under a door. The door. My heart stopped. That door had stayed shut ever since we packed up the nursery. Neither of us had dared to open it. I swallowed hard and moved toward it, my hand trembling as I turned the knob. When I pushed the door open, I froze. The boxes were gone. The room wasn't empty anymore. It was a nursery again. Everything had been unpacked, set up just the way it had been before. She put it all back. I stepped into the nursery, my stomach knotting with unease as I glanced around. Everything looked as it had before, but my chest tightened when my eyes landed on the crib. I leaned over the railing, my brows furrowing at the sight of the doll lying there, dressed and posed as if it were alive. I didn't hear you come in. The voice behind me made me jump. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my footing. Jesus, you scared me, I stammered, trying to steady my breath. What is this? What do you mean? She asked, her tone calm but her eyes sharp. The nursery. Why is everything unpacked? Our baby needs a nursery, she replied matter-of-factly. Her words hit me like a slap. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both silently questioning the other's sanity. Listen, I started, fumbling for the right words. I've done some reading about these dolls and I get it. I understand how they're helping you. Honestly, I think they've helped me a little too. But this? Recreating the nursery? You know this isn't. This isn't what? She snapped, cutting me off. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My throat felt dry, and my thoughts were a jumbled mess. I'm just worried about you, I finally managed. Well, I unpacked it all myself, she said slowly, her tone sharp as a blade. And I'll put it all back when I'm ready. Got it? Her glare pinned me in place, and I could feel the weight of all the unspoken arguments pressing down on us. My chest tightened, but all I could muster was a weak, "Okay. I need some time alone with him," she said, her voice cold and final. I nodded and stepped aside, slipping out of the room. I was trying so hard to be patient with her, to give her what she needed. But I just couldn't go to the extremes she was embracing. Pretending this doll was our son might help her cope, but it only twisted the knife in my chest deeper. That night, we didn't exchange a single word as we lay in bed. I stared out the window, tracing shapes in the moonlight, while she kept her eyes on the baby monitor she brought back to life with fresh batteries. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me into sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I stirred awake. My eyes creaked open, and the dim light of the moon spilled into the room. Everything was silent until I heard it, a faint, staticky cry coming from the baby monitor. I shot upright, rubbing my eyes and staring at the glowing screen. "Liv? Wake up," I whispered, shaking her gently. She groaned, lifting her sleeping mask and blinking at the monitor. Her eyes met mine briefly before she sighed, tossed the mask onto the nightstand, and got out of bed. "I'll take care of him. Go back to sleep," she mumbled. I sat frozen as she shuffled out of the room. My gaze flicked to the monitor, where I could hear her soft shushing. "Sure, it's okay," she cooed, her voice drifting through the static. I couldn't move. I just stared at the screen, wide-eyed, as the cries quieted and she started humming the lullaby again. A chill ran down my spine. When she came back to bed, she didn't say a word, just grabbed her mask and lay down as if nothing had happened. I wanted to go into the nursery to see for myself what was going on, but instead, I lay there, staring at the ceiling until my eyes burned and the first rays of sunlight crept into the room. When morning came, I dragged myself out of bed, feeling like a ghost. As I got dressed, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream. But deep down, I knew I was wide awake. Before I left for work, I paused by the nursery door. My hand hovered over the knob, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. Instead, I pressed my ear against the wood. The silence on the other side was deafening. I didn't know what I expected to hear, or if hearing something would have made me feel better or worse. Work was a blur that day. My head felt foggy, my eyelids heavy. I could barely keep my focus on anything anyone said to me. By the time I got home, all I wanted to do was collapse. When I walked through the door, Liv was at the sink, washing dishes. She glanced over her shoulder and smiled. "Hey, hun," she greeted. "Hey," I mumbled, setting my bag down. "How was work?" Same old, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Be quiet when you go upstairs," she said with a small chuckle. I just put him down, and it wasn't easy. Her words hung in the air like a weight. "I'll be careful not to wake him," I said, clearing my throat nervously. She shot me a quick glare before turning back to the dishes. I took the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. As I passed the nursery, I stopped. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the closed door. It loomed over me like a living thing, suffocating and heavy. Every time I passed it, it felt like the air was being squeezed out of my lungs. Dinner was oppressively quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around the room and squeezed tight. The only sounds were the occasional scrape of silverware and the faint clink of glasses. "I was thinking of taking him to a mommy and me class," Liv said suddenly, breaking the stillness. I looked up from my plate, my chewing slowing. That sounds good," I managed, forcing a smile even as my tongue felt heavy. I couldn't tell if she was being serious or if she just wanted to fill the void. "I also wish you'd spend more time with him," she added softly. "You avoid the nursery like the plague." She let out a weak laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'll make sure to do that," I said hesitantly. "Thank you." As she picked at her food, I could see the effort in her every movement. She was trying, really fucking trying, to keep herself afloat, and I hated myself for not being more understanding, for not meeting her where she was. But the truth was, we were grieving on completely different wavelengths, and instead of pulling us closer, it felt like our mourning was tearing us further apart. But there was something else gnawing at the edges of my mind. Last night, The sound of crying. How could the doll be crying? And why hadn't she seemed surprised? I cycled through every logical explanation I could muster. Maybe she set an alarm with a baby's cries? Maybe there was some kind of speaker inside the doll? But none of it added up. And worse, the crying had sounded exactly like him. For anyone else, a baby's cries might all sound the same. But not to me. I knew my son's cries. I'd know them anywhere. Maybe it was just grief playing tricks on me. I didn't know. Later that night, as I walked toward our bedroom after brushing my teeth, I paused by the nursery. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see Liv sitting in the rocking chair, slowly swaying back and forth. She was humming, the same soft melody she always hummed to him. "Hey," she said when she noticed me lingering in the doorway. "I finally got him to sleep." "That's good," I replied, the words feeling hollow as they left my mouth. "Come say good night," she urged gently, standing and walking over to the crib. I hesitated, my feet rooted in place. But her expectant gaze pulled me forward. She bent over, kissed the doll on the forehead, and turned to me. Her eyes were filled with quiet insistence. I forced myself to lean toward the crib, my lips puckered. But as I got closer, a rancid smell hit me like a brick wall. I recoiled instinctively, gagging as the stench grew overpowering. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. I'm sorry," I stammered, holding a hand to my mouth. "Him. Not it. Him. Okay, fine. He smells like a dumpster fire. What is this? Does he have built-in fecal mechanics or something?" Her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. I looked away, guilt flooding through me as I realized the words I'd just thrown at her. "Just admit it," she choked out. "Admit that this is all a joke to you. That you think I'm crazy." "Liv, no, I don't. Actually, don't say anything. Just sleep somewhere else tonight. The couch, the car, the goddamn sidewalk. I don't care." "Okay." I left the room before the tears threatening to spill from my own eyes could betray me. I felt like a monster, like I'd failed her, failed us. Trying to support her while holding on to my own sanity was tearing me apart. I collapsed onto the couch and screamed into a pillow, the muffled sound doing little to ease the fury and grief clawing at my chest. I cried until I was too exhausted to keep going and eventually drifted into a restless sleep. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by the sharp sound of glass shattering. My heart pounded as I shot upright, disoriented and panicked. The room was pitch dark, and I fumbled along the wall, searching for a light switch. "Shit," I hissed as something sharp jabbed into the bottom of my foot. Lifting it, I winced at the pain, hopping awkwardly on one leg as I tried to avoid stepping on more unseen shards. Finally, I found the switch and flicked it on. The kitchen lit up, revealing a mess of glass and flour scattered across the floor. Blood trickled down my foot, a small trail of red marking my frantic movements. I bit down hard on my cheek, grabbed the shard embedded in my skin, and yanked it out. The sharp sting made me gasp, but I quickly wrapped a dish towel around my foot to stem the bleeding. Then I noticed it, tiny, flour-coated footprints leading away from the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at them, my mind racing. The cookie jar was shattered, flour spilled everywhere, and the tracks were too small for either of us to have made. The air grew heavy around me, and I felt the familiar weight of dread settle in my chest. Something was very, very wrong. I carefully placed the last shard of porcelain into the trash, my gaze fixed on the tiny footprints in the flour. My hands trembled slightly as I knelt down to inspect them closer. They were unmistakable, small, human-like. My stomach churned. No, it couldn't be. I shook my head, forcing the thought away. This wasn't possible. But if not, then who, or what, had made them? It wasn't Liv. It wasn't an animal. And yet, the size, the shape. An uneasy weight settled on my chest as I vacuumed up the trail, trying to erase the evidence as if doing so would also erase my growing dread. The footprints extended farther than I'd anticipated, leading me out of the kitchen and through the living room. My breathing quickened as I followed the trail up the stairs, every step amplifying the pounding in my chest. When I reached the top, I froze. The trail continued down the hallway, ending at the nursery door. That door. I stood there, trembling, my breaths coming out in shallow bursts as I stared at the wood. My fingers twitched at my sides, torn between flinging the door open and running in the opposite direction. I couldn't go in. Instead, I backed away, retreating into the bathroom. Inside, I sat on the edge of the tub, gingerly inspecting my injured foot. The bandage I'd hastily wrapped around it was soaked through with blood, and bits of flour still clung to the wound. As I cleaned and rebandaged it, my mind spiraled. Why us? It wasn't just grief. It was something deeper, something cruel. Life wasn't just unfair. It was malicious, stripping away the things we loved most and leaving us to wade through the wreckage. Losing him after only a month of being, it wasn't fair. It was an act of cruelty. Once the bandage was secure, I limped back into the hallway, my body heavy with exhaustion. I stopped in front of the nursery door again, my breath hitching. From inside, faint cries began to seep through the wood. My knees weakened, and tears pooled in my eyes. I'd never been a praying man, not even in the darkest moments of my son's illness. It always felt pointless, like shouting into a void. But now, I found myself silently begging, not for miracles or answers, just for the crying to stop, for the torment to end. But no one was listening. I clenched my fists and turned away, retreating back downstairs. Even as I lay on the couch, pulling the blanket over me, the cries followed, muffled but persistent. I closed my eyes and tried to block them out, but it was impossible. Every wail pierced through me, each one echoing in my skull, shattering whatever grip I had left on reality. At some point, exhaustion won. The cries must have stopped eventually, but I didn't remember when. Jack. I jolted awake at the sound of Liv's voice and the gentle pressure of her hand on my shoulder. My head whipped toward her, my heart racing. Didn't mean to scare you, she said softly. It's fine, I muttered, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. I just didn't sleep. Her face was etched with guilt, her brows pinched together as if she was carrying the weight of the world. Is everything all right? She asked hesitantly. I hesitated, the memories of the night before flashing in my mind. I want to apologize for last night, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. You've been so patient with me, and I feel like I've been asking for more than you can handle. We stood there in silence for a moment, our eyes avoiding each other. I appreciate it, I finally said, my voice cracking. And I'm sorry, too. I've been too judgmental. We don't have to be on the same page to care about each other. Liv nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something. Maybe hope? But beneath it all, the unease still lingered, clawing at the edges of my mind. I stood frozen in the hallway, my breath catching in my throat. The sight before me was surreal. Liv, cradling the doll she had claimed to have thrown away, humming softly as if soothing a real child. My lips parted to speak, but no words came out. She noticed me in the doorway and offered a soft, almost dreamy smile. Morning, she said, her voice light, almost cheerful. I thought. You said you threw it out. I managed to croak. I did, she replied, brushing the doll's cheek with her thumb. But then I realized it wasn't fair to him. I couldn't just abandon him like that. He needs me, Jack. Liv, it's a doll. Her expression hardened instantly, and her eyes narrowed. No, he's our son. And you keep calling him a doll like he doesn't matter. Like he's replaceable. Liv, you said it yourself. He was molding. You told me that. That's because I wasn't taking good enough care of him. But I fixed it. I cleaned him up. He's fine now. She held the doll tighter, her voice trembling with an edge of desperation. Liv, this isn't healthy. What isn't healthy, she snapped, is the way you've been acting. You act like you're the only one who lost him. Like your grief is the only grief that matters. But I'm here too, Jack. I'm here, and I'm trying to keep him alive in the only way I can. And all you've done is judge me for it. That's not fair, I said, my voice rising. I've been trying to be there for you. But this isn't him. It's not going to bring him back. Her face crumpled, and she turned away from me, rocking the doll gently. "You'll never understand," she whispered. I stood there for a moment, watching her, my heart aching. I didn't know what to say, how to help, or even if I could anymore. "I'm going to work," I said finally, my voice hollow. She didn't respond. At work, I couldn't focus. My boss's lectures about productivity barely registered. All I could think about was Liv, her fragile state, the doll, the look in her eyes as she cradled it. I felt like I was spiraling alongside her, caught in the undertow of grief with no way out. When I got home, the house was eerily quiet. Liv wasn't in the living room or the kitchen. "Liv?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space. No answer. A sense of dread crept over me as I made my way upstairs. The nursery door was ajar, and I could see her sitting in the rocking chair, the doll in her lap. "Liv," I said softly, stepping inside. She looked up at me, her eyes glassy. "He was crying again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at her, the words catching in my throat. "Liv, there's no way it could cry." "Yes, there is," she said, her gaze locking onto mine. "You just don't hear it because you don't listen. You don't believe. But I hear him. I feel him. He's still here, Jack." My chest tightened, and I took a step closer. "Liv, you need help." "I don't need help," she said, her voice sharpening. "I need you to believe me." "Why can't you just believe me?" "Because it's not real," I said, my voice breaking. Her face twisted with anger and pain, and she clutched the doll tighter, shielding it from me as if I were a threat. "Get out," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "If you can't support me, then just get out." I opened my mouth to argue but stopped myself. The weight of everything crushed down on me, and I couldn't find the strength to fight anymore. "Fine," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. "I'll sleep downstairs again." She didn't respond, her focus entirely on the doll in her arms. As I walked out of the room, I could swear I heard a faint sound, soft, high-pitched, and unmistakable. A cry. I froze, my blood turning cold. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. And yet, the sound persisted, lingering in the air long after I'd closed the door behind me. I laid there, frozen, my body refusing to respond as the cries pierced through the baby monitor. The sound wasn't distant like before. It was vivid, raw, echoing through the room as if it were coming from just behind the door. My gaze darted around the room, wild and desperate, but all I could see was the faint glow of the monitor on the bedside table and the shadowed outline of Liv beside me. She stirred slightly, her arms still draped over my chest, oblivious to the cries. I tried to will my fingers to move, to wake her, to do anything, but they remained glued in place. My breathing quickened, shallow gasps barely filling my lungs as my heart thudded erratically. The cries grew louder, sharper, like nails scraping against the inside of my skull. "This isn't real. It's not real," I told myself. But the sound, it felt too real. Then, amidst the crying, I heard something else. A soft shuffle, the faintest creak of a floorboard. It was coming from the hallway. My eyes shot toward the door, straining to see through the darkness. My mind raced, grappling with the impossibility of it all. I wanted to scream, to call out for Liv, but my lips refused to part. The shuffling grew louder, accompanied by an irregular rhythm, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled along the floor. My chest heaved with silent screams as I watched the doorknob slowly turn. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but the pitch-black void of the hallway beyond. But then, faintly, I saw it. 2 small feet, bare, pale, and impossibly tiny, stepped into the room. The cries ceased abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. I couldn't blink. I couldn't breathe. The feet moved closer, and as they did, the air grew colder. My skin prickled as a wave of dread washed over me, heavier than anything I'd ever felt. And then I saw him. The doll, or what looked like the doll, stood at the foot of the bed. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, its glassy eyes catching the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. But it wasn't just a doll anymore. Its chest rose and fell, shallow breaths fogging the air. Its mouth hung slightly open, a twisted grin playing at the corners. It moved, not like a toy, not stiffly or clumsily, but fluidly, as if it were alive. Tears streamed down my face as I fought against the invisible force holding me down. My mind screamed at me to wake up, to break free, but I was trapped, a prisoner in my own body. The doll climbed onto the bed, its tiny hands gripping the edge of the mattress. It crawled up, closer and closer, until it was just inches from my face. Its cold, lifeless eyes stared into mine, and in a voice that wasn't quite human, it whispered, "Daddy." The paralysis broke, and I shot upright with a guttural scream. Liv jolted awake beside me, her hand gripping my arm. "Jack, what's wrong?" she cried, her voice laced with panic. I panted heavily, my body drenched in sweat as I scanned the room. The doll was gone, the door closed, and the baby monitor silent. It was here, I stammered. It was in the room. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her brows furrowing in confusion. The doll, it moved. It spoke. Her expression softened, shifting from concern to pity. "Jack, it's just the grief," she said gently. "You're dreaming. It's not real." But her words didn't comfort me, because deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. And whatever was happening, it wasn't over. A wave of nausea and disbelief crashed over me as her words hung in the air. My legs buckled, and I stumbled back, my back hitting the nursery wall. No, this can't be real. This isn't real." She clutched the remains to her chest, rocking back and forth, her cries broken and guttural. "Liv, what did you do?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gazed down at the grotesque bundle in her arms, stroking it as if it were still a fragile infant. "I couldn't let him go," she finally said, her voice distant, devoid of reason. "He was ours, Jack. He is ours. I couldn't just let them take him away from me. From us." Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at me, pleading. "Don't you understand? We weren't ready to say goodbye. I couldn't bury him, not like that. Not in the cold, dark ground. He's my baby. Our baby." I felt like I was suffocating, the walls of the room closing in on me. My mind raced to connect the dots, to find some semblance of logic in her madness. You took him?" I choked out. "From the morgue? From the cemetery? Liv, what did you do?" "I brought him home," she said softly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I kept him safe. And when his body started to change, I found another way. I found someone who could help." The bile rose in my throat. "Help? What do you mean, help?" Her eyes darted away, guilt flickering across her face. "There are people who can do things that shouldn't be possible. I just wanted to bring him back, Jack, to make him whole again. For us." My hand shook uncontrollably as I stared at her. This isn't bringing him back, Olivia. This is an abomination." "Don't you dare call him that," she screamed, clutching the remains tighter. Her voice was raw, a mix of anguish and fury. "He's our son. I did this for us." "No," I said, my voice firm despite the terror coursing through me. "You did this for you." Her eyes burned with fury, but before she could respond, the room seemed to shift. A chill swept through the nursery, and the air grew heavy. And then, I heard it, the crying. But this time, it wasn't coming from the remains in her arms or the baby monitor. It came from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air around us. It was deafening, distorted, like 100 voices weeping in unison. Olivia's face twisted in confusion and fear as she clutched her ears. "Stop it! Stop it!" she screamed. I stumbled back further, my heart pounding in my chest. The crib rattled violently, and the mobile above it spun wildly. The soft lullaby it once played now warped and sinister. Then, the crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, chilling whisper. "Dad!" The room plunged into darkness, and the temperature plummeted. I could hear Olivia's ragged breaths and my own pounding heartbeat, but nothing else. And then, a pair of small, glowing eyes appeared in the shadows. "Dada," the voice said again, this time closer. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The eyes darted toward Olivia, and her screams pierced the air as the darkness consumed her. "Olivia!" I shouted, lunging forward, but it was too late. The shadows swirled around her, pulling her into their abyss. I stood there, paralyzed, as the room returned to silence. The crib was empty, the remains gone. The nursery door creaked open behind me, and I turned slowly, my entire body trembling. There, standing in the hallway, was the doll, or what was left of it. Its glassy eyes stared up at me, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. "Dada!" It whispered one last time before the world went black. When I woke, I was lying on the living room floor, the morning light streaming through the windows. The nursery was empty, the house eerily quiet. Olivia was gone. The doll was gone. But the cries, they never stopped. Every night, they echoed through the house, relentless and haunting. And I knew, deep down, that they would never leave. Because life isn't just unfair. It's cruel.